Now, I'm going to go back to the story of Huw Edwards, who, of course, has pleaded guilty to 3 counts of making indecent images of children, and joined in the studio by David Woode, who was at that court hearing today. Welcome to you, David. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Can you just take us through what happened, what you saw and what we learned?
So this morning, Huw Edwards appeared at court number 1 at Westminster Magistrates Court, where he kind of took all of us by surprise by entering 3 guilty pleas to making indecent images. We learned that he and an unnamed man had swapped 377 sexual images, of which 41 were indecent images of children. They were classed in 3 categories, A, B and C, A being the worst, most severe. There were 7 in category A, 12 in category B, and 22 in category C. It was a 26-minute hearing. We had a brief outline of the case, and essentially the prosecutors told the court how Edwards had been in conversation on WhatsApp with a man between December 2020 and August 2021, during which these messages were shared. The person who we now know the identity of had warned him about one of the images of one of the people in the exchange, that they looked quite young, for which Huw Edwards said, "Don't send me anything illegal." In the last hour, it's just been confirmed to us by the Metropolitan Police that when Huw Edwards was arrested in November last year, it had nothing to do with the claims by a young person that were made in a tabloid newspaper. He was arrested because there was a separate investigation at South Wales Police into a 25-year-old man whose phone had been downloaded, and that led them to Huw Edwards. This person, who we now know is Alex Williams, who's 28 from Merthyr Tydfil, sorry, 25, excuse me, from Merthyr Tydfil, was convicted of a number of offences involving the possession of indecent and prohibited images of children. He was sentenced to a 12-month suspended sentence at Cardiff Crown Court earlier this year. And it turns out the BBC were aware that Huw Edwards had been arrested in November last year, and they were aware of the mental health and physical health conditions that he had experienced. But as he hadn't been charged, they were monitoring the situation at the time. And so this is all coming out in the last hour.
Right, and the person you're telling us about now has been through the process and received a suspended sentence.
Suspended sentence for, I believe it was 6 or 7 counts of possessing and distributing indecent images, and also possessing prohibited images of children.
And if I'm reading what you're telling me correctly, this person was more of a prime mover in these events than was Huw Edwards. Is that correct?
It's hard to kind of...
They were in communication.
They were in communication.
These images.
Yes.
Because we did learn at this first appearance, didn't we, from circumstances from the perspective of Huw Edwards, from his own lawyer, of what went on, more of the background of all of this, what he did do and what he didn't do, what he instigated, what he did not instigate. That's not common at the first appearance, but they could become relevant when the time comes to pass sentence.
Well, exactly. So we were told, and it was very brief, the outline that was given to the court. Philip Evans, KC, who represented Huw Edwards, made it very clear that his client had not taken the images, nor had he distributed the images. He'd simply opened them on WhatsApp and viewed them. And there was no suggestion that they were shared with other third parties.
Thank you so much indeed for getting us up to date with that latest news. That's David Woode, who's the crime correspondent at The Times. Now, in a moment, I'm going to be going back to the story of the Olympics, and it is a good story, and we're going to talk to someone who always deserves a round of applause and a salute whenever he pops up. It is Sir Steve Redgrave. We're going to get Steve Redgrave's thoughts on the way it's going in Paris. Now, though, it's 5:32. Let's get the news with Mike Powell. Now, the former BBC newsreader Huw Edwards has pleaded guilty to 3 charges of making indecent images of children. He admitted viewing 41 indecent images of children, including 2 children believed to be between the ages of 7 and 9. Earlier, Tim Luckhurst, a former BBC editor who's now principal of South College of Durham University, told Times Radio he knew Huw Edwards early in his career.
These allegations, which are now clearly admitted and which will therefore lead at some point to sentencing are very, very serious indeed. My suspicion is that these are things which have happened towards the end of Huw's career, that there would be no awareness of such private conduct at the BBC unless he
Wow.
himself had come forward and said that he'd been guilty of such offences. Now, if it does emerge that the BBC knew anything, that would of course be extremely serious.
Right, so let's just discuss that for a while with my colleague here at Times Radio, Adam Bolton, former anchor and political editor at Sky News. Hi, Adam. Thanks for joining us.
John.
Look, so you were part of Sky News, that big news organisation. I was part of that one, the BBC for many years. This story is a news organisation, a big news organisation's worst nightmare, isn't it? It's worse still for the BBC in some ways, as the keeper of the country's culture and identity and £6 billion or more of the British public's money.
Yes, it has to be said, it's very difficult for us to talk about as well because we both know Huw. You had him as a colleague at the BBC. I worked alongside him at Westminster for a very long time and would regard him as a friend in that period. Yeah, it is very, very embarrassing. I was just looking at the images of Huw walking into the court today, the sort of thing he, like us, has reported on with other people so often, but the tables are turned. And clearly he has pleaded guilty to, a serious and criminal offence, which many people would absolutely condemn, quite rightly. So how do you report it? How do you deal with it? I think in terms of what the BBC is putting on screen, one wouldn't criticise them at all for what they're doing. But it does raise questions for them, as we were hearing in that discussion with Tim Luckhurst. What did they know when? Yeah. And, particularly in this case, it now appears that they went on paying him for some 6 months after he'd been arrested. Did they know he'd been arrested? If someone is arrested, they're not guilty until they go to court. So would it be right to take any particular action? And of course, when it comes to the BBC, at hard times, making redundancies in the news business, there's always the question of, the money they gave to him, could or should it have been better spent? So that is very awkward. And they also have the question of his behaviour while he was at the BBC. Yeah. We don't know that there was necessarily anything to do with these sexual images of young people. We do know, because it was revealed from within the BBC by Victoria Derbyshire, that apparently there were younger colleagues of Huw who latterly were not happy with his behaviour and his interaction with them. And, we haven't yet really heard the results of that internal investigation. So there are a lot of things that one quite understands that institutionally the BBC is, not giving answers about, which is always difficult if you're a news organisation.
Yeah, but there's a limit to what is in the public domain. Some of it is in the public domain, and I think we do know that the subject of these charges to which he's pleaded guilty does not touch on those matters of his private conduct while he was at the BBC and his relationships.
No, it doesn't, but I'm saying...
Yeah, so this is a separate matter. And the existence of these criminal charges to which he's pleaded guilty takes the whole thing into a completely different place and a completely different level. But the questions you raised there that Tim Luckhurst touched upon are very much the questions. And we have no knowledge of whether the BBC had any notion of this criminal misconduct before the rest of the world, before the rest of the country. If that turns out to be the case, and there will be lots of questions about that, that's going to be just acutely, painfully embarrassing.
Yeah. Although I think Tim Luckhurst makes a point that this doesn't directly relate at all to the work which Huw did when he was at the BBC, which is different, of course, from either the Jimmy Savile scandal, where the BBC have now sort of effectively cancelled Jimmy Savile, except for making dramas about it, or indeed the Martin Bashir interview with Diana that they've also decided they're not going to show ever again. So it doesn't relate to his work there, which I think does make a difference from the perspective of the BBC.
Yes. I mean, it's going to be the subject of enormous comment, enormous coverage from here on in. And I guess you have to wonder, because any scandal, this is a scandal within the BBC. It's maybe not a scandal of the BBC, but a scandal within the BBC. Whether that's going to lead to any kind of reflection, leading to changes in the way the BBC does what it does, internally or in any other way. I guess we can't know that yet.
I think there's a general current against big, highly paid anchors at the moment. I think, there is a sort of levelling up and perhaps a sort of behaviour that was tolerated from big stars is no longer tolerated, and the next generation won't behave like that. I mean, the BBC, because in a sense Huw was a historic figure, or at least involved with so many historic occasions, also has a problem with its archive.
Yes.
I mean, does it show Huw announcing the death of the Queen or the various other major, chairing the election? The BBC likes to replay its election like programmes. Does it cancel Huw Edwards? My view is probably different from a lot of other people.
What's your view?
I don't think they should, because I
think they should expunge that?
No, I don't. I think his work that he did for the BBC stands. It's part of the archive. I don't think when we play more historic archive from those very fruitily voiced announcers or whatever, you're necessarily endorsing them or not. You're simply showing what happened at the time to inform the public.
Okay, well, Adam, good to get your thoughts on this. We're going to be talking a little more about this story, as you would expect, later on here on Drive. Thanks, Adam.